The word hit Jane Vaughn like a slap across the face, loud enough for the whole congregation of Dusty Creek, Texas to hear it in the year of our Lord 1882. Unfit. Reverend Calloway had said it from the pulpit itself, not even bothering to lower his voice, not even offering her the dignity of a private conversation. He stood there in his black coat with his Bible pressed flat against his chest, and he looked down at Jane where she sat in the third pew with her hands folded in her lap, and he said the word like it was scripture, like God himself had whispered it into his ear on a Sunday morning and told him to broadcast it to every soul in Dusty Creek. Miss Jane Vaughn is unfit for the institution of holy matrimony. I will not bless any union that places this woman in a position of wife or mother. It is my sacred duty to warn this community. The silence that followed was the loudest thing Jane had ever heard. It was louder than the thunderstorm that had ripped the roof off the feed store 2 winters ago. It was louder than the gunshot that had ended her father's life on the porch of their ranch 6 years back. It swallowed everything: the creak of the pew, the rustle of Sunday dresses, the distant lowing of cattle from the fields outside, and it swallowed Jane herself. She stood up slowly, because she would not give any one of them the satisfaction of watching her crumble. Her spine was straight and her chin was level, and her dark eyes swept the room once, cataloging each face that looked away, each neighbor who suddenly found their hands fascinating, each woman who pressed her lips together in that particular way that said she had known all along. Jane walked down the center aisle without rushing, pushed open the heavy oak door, and stepped out into the burning Texas sun. She made it exactly to the far side of the water trough before the shaking started. She pressed both hands flat against the rough wood of the trough's side and breathed through it, focusing on the sensation of sun-warmed pine beneath her palms, the smell of horse and hay and dust, the particular quality of light that painted Dusty Creek's main street in shades of bleached gold every Sunday morning. She would not weep. She had already given Dusty Creek too many of her tears, and she had made a promise to herself in the dark of many difficult nights that she was done making that particular donation. What she had not expected was the man leaning against the hitching post 10 feet away, watching her with an expression she could not immediately name. She had seen Arthur Brenner before, of course. Everyone in 3 counties had seen Arthur Brenner. He was impossible to miss, tall in a way that came from honest labor rather than the luck of heredity, broad through the shoulder, with a jaw that looked like it had been cut from the same red sandstone the Colorado River spent centuries carving through. He wore his dark hat pulled low and his worn leather vest open over a clean white shirt, and he had the unhurried stillness of a man who had learned that the world generally came to him if he waited long enough. He owned the Brenner Ranch, 20,000 acres of the best grazing land in Comanche County, and he had been running it alone for 3 years since his brother Eli died of fever and left him the whole enterprise. He was 31 years old, had never married, and was known throughout the territory as the kind of man you did not cross, did not cheat, and did not approach lightly on a bad day. He was watching Jane Vaughn shake against a water trough after being publicly condemned from a pulpit, and his expression was the one she finally identified as fury. Not at her. That was the thing. The fury was pointed somewhere else entirely. "Miss Vaughn," he said, and his voice was low and even the way a man speaks when he is exercising considerable restraint. "You all right?" "I am perfectly fine, Mr. Brenner," she said, which was such an obvious falsehood that she almost laughed. He pushed off the hitching post and crossed to her in 4 unhurried strides, and he leaned against the water trough beside her, close enough that she could see the tension in his forearms and the hard set of his mouth. He looked out at the street. She looked out at the street. Neither of them looked at each other. "That was a shameful thing," he said, "what Calloway just did." She turned to look at him then because she had not been expecting that. In Dusty Creek, Reverend Calloway's word was taken as the next best thing to divine law. The man had been calling the shots in this community for 20 years, and nobody with land, money, or reputation to protect ever argued with him. "Most people in that room would disagree with you," she said carefully. "Most people in that room are cowards," Arthur said, and the flatness of the statement left no room for argument. She studied his profile for a long moment. "Why do you care, Mr. Brenner?" He turned his head then, and the dark eyes under the brim of that hat met hers directly. "Because what was done to you was unjust," he said simply. "And I don't stand quietly in the presence of injustice." Jane did not know it yet, but that was the sentence that would change her life. Everything that followed, the secrets, the forced choices, the betrayal that came out of a dark past she had been running from, the trap that someone set for them both, the ultimate sacrifice they would each have to make before they found their way to each other. It all began with those 16 words spoken on a Sunday morning in the dust of Dusty Creek, Texas. She needed to understand how she had arrived at this moment, at this water trough, at this crossroads, where one man had just offered her the first unguarded kindness she had received in longer than she could remember. Jane Vaughn's story in Dusty Creek had begun 6 years earlier, in the autumn of 1876, when her father Hector Vaughn had ridden home from a poker game in Abilene with an empty wallet, a broken-down horse, and a deed to 340 acres of scrub range that a desperate man had wagered and lost. Hector had been many things in his life: charming, reckless, occasionally brilliant, frequently drunk. But he had never been a rancher, and the land he brought home was rough country that needed serious work and serious capital to become anything worth having. Jane had been 19 years old, fresh from 2 years at a teacher's seminary in San Antonio that her mother's small inheritance had paid for, and she had come home for the summer intending to return in the fall. Instead, she found her father with this deed and this dream and the particular excited light in his eyes that she had learned, over a lifetime of watching him, meant that someone was about to work very hard, and it was probably going to be her. Her mother had died when Jane was 12. There were no brothers or sisters. There was only Jane. So Jane had stayed. She had read books on cattle management borrowed from the Abilene Library. She had learned to ride properly instead of side saddle. She had learned to mend fence and red weather and negotiate with the cattle buyers in Fort Worth who had a long-established habit of cheating women and newcomers, and anyone else they thought they could get away with cheating. She had worked the Vaughn land with 2 hired hands, a man named Cooper who was 60 years old and steady as iron, and a young Mexican hand named Diego who was 17 and learning the trade alongside her. She had built something real out of that scrub range. By 1878, they were running 200 head on improved pasture, and by 1879 Jane had saved enough to sink a second well and build a proper barn. Hector Vaughn had been proud of her in a vague, distracted way, the way a man is proud of a particularly clever horse. He had also, in the winter of 1879, borrowed money from a man named Clem Dooley, who ran the bank and also operated a less formal lending enterprise out of the back room of his saloon, and Hector had borrowed more than the ranch could easily repay. He had been shot on the porch of the ranch house in the spring of 1880 by a person or persons unknown, which was what the sheriff's report said, and which everyone in the county understood to mean something rather more specific. Clem Dooley had an alibi that was as solid as the men whose loyalty he paid for, and so the matter had been filed away and officially forgotten. Jane had paid the debt. It had taken everything she had saved, and it had put her back 3 years in terms of what she could do with the land, but she had paid every dollar because she was not her father and she did not deal in debt she could not cover. Clem Dooley had accepted the money with a smile that suggested he found her determination charming in the way a man finds a small animal charming when it does something unexpectedly bold. She had not liked that smile then, and as the years passed, she liked it less. The judgment that Reverend Calloway had delivered from his pulpit that Sunday morning in May of 1882 had a history behind it. It was not arbitrary. Jane knew its origins exactly, and she knew who had planted the seed that had grown into Calloway's condemnation, because she knew whose interests it served, and she had learned over 6 years to read the architecture of other people's scheming. Clem Dooley wanted her land. He had wanted it for 2 years, and she had refused to sell, and he had tried every avenue available to a man of his particular type. He had offered money, and she had declined. He had made noise about a disputed boundary survey, and her lawyer in Abilene had dismantled that argument in 2 pages of clear correspondence. He had sent men to drink at the water holes and scare her cattle, and Cooper had run them off with a shotgun and reported the incident to the deputy sheriff in the next county over, which was outside Dooley's immediate jurisdiction. And so Dooley had arrived at a more patient and more insidious strategy. He had begun cultivating Reverend Calloway's ear. The specific accusation that Calloway had broadcast from the pulpit that morning, that Jane was unfit, rested on 2 pillars, both of them carefully constructed from distorted truth. The first was that Jane had, at the age of 22, briefly kept company with a young surveyor from Houston named Paul Reeves, who had subsequently left Dusty Creek without marrying her, which was taken as evidence of moral failing, even though the failure had been entirely Paul Reeves's, and had consisted of already having a wife in Houston that nobody in Dusty Creek had known about. Jane had not known about it either, but that nuance had been thoroughly ironed out of the story by the time it circulated through the community. The second pillar was that Jane ran her ranch like a man, meaning that she made her own decisions, negotiated her own contracts, and declined to be managed by anyone, which Reverend Calloway, in his pastoral wisdom, had decided constituted a defiance of the natural order that made her unsuitable for the domestic role of wife. This argument conveniently ignored the fact that the ranch was currently the most productive small operation in the county, but agricultural productivity was not Calloway's area of concern. Jane knew all of this. She had watched the architecture assemble itself over months. She had even gone to Calloway privately, 3 weeks earlier, and told him what she believed was happening, told him that Clem Dooley was using him, and watched the Reverend's face close like a trap on the suggestion that he might be anyone's instrument. What she had not expected, despite knowing the threat was real, was the public nature of the attack. She had underestimated Dooley's impatience and Calloway's willingness to go all the way. Standing at the water trough with Arthur Brenner beside her, she explained none of this. It was not his business, and she did not make a habit of importing her problems into other people's lives. What she said was, "Thank you for the kindness, Mr. Brenner. I should be getting home." And he said, "I'll ride with you." She turned to look at him with an expression that on a less controlled face would have been outright alarm. "That isn't necessary, Miss Vaughn," he said, and there was something patient and immovable in his voice, like a mountain explaining that it was not planning to relocate. "You have just been publicly humiliated by a man who is either a fool or someone's puppet in front of the entire population of this county. You should not ride home alone." She held his gaze for a long moment, running calculations. She was not a woman who accepted help easily, because in her experience help came with conditions, and the conditions were usually things she did not want to agree to. But Arthur Brenner's dark eyes were steady and direct, and whatever was in them, it was not the look of a man who was running a calculation of his own. "All right," she said. They rode out of Dusty Creek side by side in the Sunday morning light, and she waited for him to ask questions or offer opinions or begin the particular kind of helpful mansplaining that she generally found so exhausting. He did none of those things. He rode quietly, matching his big roan horse's pace to her mare's shorter stride, and he watched the country around them with the attentive habit of a man who had learned that the landscape had things to say. "How long have you been running your place alone?" he asked after they had covered nearly a mile. "Since my father died," she said. 2 years. That's hard work for one person. I have help. Cooper and Diego have been with me 6 years." And I hired a third hand last fall, a woman named Ruth who can outwork anyone on the place including me. A corner of his mouth moved. A woman hand. She needed the work, she's good at it. I don't see the difficulty. There's no difficulty, he said. I was thinking I should have thought of that. Jane glanced at him sideways. Your outfit is enormous, Mr. Brenner. Surely you don't lack for hands. I lack for people who don't steal from me, he said flatly. Lost my foreman last winter to the business of helping himself to my cattle records and my buyer relationships. Before that I lost a hand to whiskey and another one to a better offer from a man down in Webb County. Loyalty is a scarce commodity. She understood that. She understood it precisely. I'm sorry, she said, and meant it. They reached the Vaughn ranch gate and she pulled her mare up, expecting him to stop and say goodbye. Instead, he guided his roan through the gate after her, into the yard, and dismounted with the easy economy of a man who has gotten on and off horses 10,000 times. Cooper was on the porch, a mug of coffee in one hand, watching their arrival with an expression of calm speculation. He was a spare, weathered man with white hair and eyes the color of faded denim, and he had been working this land since before Jane was born, and had an excellent instinct for reading situations. Morning, Mr. Brenner, Cooper said. Cooper, Arthur said, which indicated they knew each other, which Jane noted. Miss Jane, Cooper said, looking at her directly, everything all right. Reverend Calloway delivered some opinions from the pulpit this morning, she said, keeping her voice level. Mr. Brenner was kind enough to ride out with me. Cooper's faded eyes sharpened. Did he? He did. Cooper looked at Arthur. Something passed between the two men that Jane couldn't quite decode, the kind of communication that happens in a language built from shared experience and mutual understanding rather than words. Coffee's on, Cooper said, and went back inside. Arthur tied his roan to the rail and followed Jane up the porch steps, and she held the door open for him with an expression that suggested she wasn't entirely sure how this had come to pass, but here they were. Her kitchen was the best room in the house, because it was the room she had spent the most time improving. She had replaced the original rough plank table with one she had ordered from a carpenter in Abilene, solid oak with a smooth top, and the iron cookstove was the good model that she had saved for 2 years to buy. The curtains on the windows were her own work, plain white cotton, functional, but clean and well-made. Books were stacked on a shelf beside the back door, more books than most ranch houses in the county contained. Arthur looked at the books as he took the seat Cooper indicated at the table. Jane noticed him looking, and something in her, some habitual defensiveness, braced for a comment. Instead, he reached out and tilted the spine of the top volume so he could read the title. It was a survey of cattle breeding practices published in 1879 by a university in Ohio. I've been trying to get a copy of this for 8 months, he said. She blinked. You know the book? I know of it. Somebody told me about the chapter on heat-resistant cattle strains for Southern Plains ranching. You couldn't find it at Abilene or Fort Worth. I ordered it direct from the publisher, she said, sitting down across from him. It took 4 months and 2 letters. Would you be willing to lend it when you're finished? She looked at him for a moment. I've read it twice, she said. You can borrow it now if you want. He looked at her with something that she was not yet equipped to name, something that was less than surprise and more than simple appreciation. Thank you, he said. Cooper poured coffee for all 3 of them and settled in the third chair. And for the next hour, while the Sunday morning settled into Sunday afternoon, and the mockingbirds argued in the mesquite outside the kitchen window, they talked about cattle. They talked about the drought conditions building in the western sections, about the Santa Gertrudis cross that some ranchers were experimenting with, about the new refrigerated rail cars that were changing the Chicago market prices, and what that meant for independent sellers. They talked about the politics of the Cattle Buyers Association and the ways in which small operators were consistently disadvantaged by the fee structure. Jane had never in her life talked about these things with anyone who engaged with them, the way Arthur Brenner engaged with them, with genuine knowledge and genuine interest, and the willingness to change his position when presented with a better argument. Cooper could hold a conversation about cattle, but Cooper was not a strategist. Diego was a brilliant worker but young and still learning. The Fort Worth buyers were conversationalists only in the way that sharks are conversationalists, all teeth and angled purpose. Arthur argued with her about the rail car economics and turned out to be partly right, which she acknowledged, and she made a counter-argument about direct marketing that he had not considered, which he acknowledged. And at some point during this exchange, she realized that her hands had relaxed on the table, and her shoulders had descended from somewhere near her ears to their natural position, and she felt, for the first time since standing up in that church pew, like herself. She noticed this, and the noticing made her careful. When he stood to leave, she walked him out to his horse. The afternoon had turned golden, the particular thick gold of a Texas spring afternoon when the light thickens and the whole landscape looks like it's been poured in amber. "Miss Vaughn," he said, gathering his reins, "what Calloway said this morning, is it going to affect your operation? Practically speaking," she considered lying and decided she was too tired for it. "It might. 2 of my regular buyers have wives who are active in Calloway's congregation. If those women decide their husbands should find a different source for their cattle, I lose contracts that will hurt." "And Clem Dooley," he said, and she heard in the way he said it that he already knew at least part of the architecture. She looked at him steadily. "You know about Dooley's interest in my land." "I know about Dooley's interests in general," he said. "He's been making expansionist noises for 2 years. Your acreage sits between his property on the south and mine on the north, which makes it strategically attractive." "Between yours and his," she said slowly, and something in the geography of that settled into place with an ominous click. "If he acquires your land and I don't, he has a corridor to the river that would give him a significant water advantage over my northern pastures," Arthur said. "And Clem Dooley does not let advantages go unexploited. So you also have an interest in who owns the Vaughn ranch," she said carefully, because she needed to know where this was going and she needed to know it before any other attachment formed. Arthur looked at her. The evening light caught the planes of his face and she saw no evasion in it, no deflection, only a directness that was somehow simultaneously uncomfortable and reassuring. "Yes," he said, "I won't pretend otherwise. But that is not why I rode out with you this morning." "Then why did you?" "Because what Calloway did was wrong," he said, "and someone needed to say so, and because you walked out of that church alone when you shouldn't have had to." She held his gaze for a long moment, making assessments, running the calculation that any sensible person runs when a stranger offers help, and the help is real but the world is complicated. "I'll think on what you've said about the geography," she said finally. He nodded, mounted, and turned the roan toward the gate. He rode perhaps 20 yards before he turned back. "Miss Vaughn, the buyer contracts. I can put you in contact with Harlan Macy in Fort Worth. He's independent of the main Buyers Association. He won't care what Calloway says and he pays fair price." She filed this information away. "Thank you." He touched the brim of his hat and rode out. She stood in the yard watching the red dust settle where his horse had been, and she told herself with considerable firmness that she was not going to think about his eyes. She thought about his eyes for the rest of the evening. The week that followed was a demonstration of how quickly a small community could translate a public judgment into practical consequences. The wife of one of her cattle buyers sent a message through her husband declining Jane's standing invitation to Sunday dinner. The dry goods store extended its usual payment terms from 30 days to 10, which was a signal rather than a genuine financial requirement. 2 young women who had occasionally visited Jane for the informal lessons she gave in reading and basic accounting stopped coming, which hurt more than she had expected. What did not happen was what she had feared most. The ranch hand stayed. Cooper showed up every morning with the same steady competence he always had, and Diego had, in fact, already known that Reverend Calloway was wrong about most things. And Ruth, who had faced far more direct and personal injustice than a preacher's opinion, treated the whole matter with a philosophical equanimity that Jane found both instructive and comforting. The land did not care. The cattle did not care. The spring grass was coming in well on the east pasture, and there was decent water in the creek, and the work was the work and it absorbed her. Arthur Brenner rode by on a Wednesday, which was not a social day by any conventional measure. He had a question about a surveyor's mark on the northern boundary of her property that was relevant to both their operations, and they spent 2 hours in the field with a map, sorting it out, and then somehow ended up back at the kitchen table with coffee again. And the conversation about cattle became a conversation about water rights, and the conversation about water rights became a conversation about the books on her shelf. And Jane found herself recommending a novel that she would have bet her best mare he had never read, and he surprised her by saying he had. "George Eliot," she said, a little incredulous. "My mother had good taste," he said. "She read me a chapter of Middlemarch every night for a year when I was 12. I finished it on my own when she died." She absorbed this. "How old were you when your mother died?" 13, he said. "My brother Eli was 10. I'm sorry." "My father was already gone by then," he said, and the way he said it, not bitter, not performing stoicism, simply factual, told her something important about the particular kind of solitude that had built this man. "The ranch raised us. Cooper actually worked for my father before the place came to me. He moved to your father's operation after Eli and I were old enough to manage." Jane stared at him. "Cooper worked for your family." "About 4 years before your father came to the county." He watched her process this. "Cooper's a good judge of character. He wouldn't have stayed with your operation this long if you weren't worth staying for." She looked down at her coffee cup, feeling something she was not prepared to name move through her chest. He did not press it. That was the thing about Arthur Brenner that she was slowly learning to identify and trust. He presented things and then gave her the space to do whatever she needed to do with them. He did not crowd, did not maneuver, did not push. For a woman who had spent the better part of 6 years being pushed from various directions, this quality was so unusual that it took her a while to stop waiting for the angle. He came by twice the following week. Once on legitimate business involving a shared fence line, and once on a Saturday morning with a copy of a newspaper from San Antonio that had an article about new developments in artesian well drilling that he thought she would find useful, which she did. Both times he stayed for coffee, and both times the conversation lasted longer than either of them had apparently planned. On the second Saturday, Ruth was in the kitchen when he arrived. Ruth was a tall, formidable woman of 30 who had come to the Vaughn ranch the previous autumn after leaving a bad situation in Galveston that she did not elaborate on, and Jane did not press her to explain. She had arms like iron cables and a laugh like a crow, and she was the most capable person Jane had ever hired. Ruth looked at Arthur when he came in, and then she looked at Jane, and her expression was eloquent in ways that Jane elected to ignore. After he left, Ruth said, "That man has been here 4 times in 2 weeks. He has legitimate reasons," Jane said, without looking up from the well-drilling article she was rereading. "Mum," said Ruth, "we share a boundary line." "You share a boundary line with 6 other ranchers and none of them have been here at all." "Ruth, I'm just observing facts, Miss Jane. That's what you pay me for." Jane looked up at that, and Ruth had on the expression that combined affectionate mischief with the particular wisdom of someone who had survived enough of the world to know what was actually worth paying attention to. "He's a complicated situation," Jane said. "The best ones usually are," Ruth said, and went back to her work. In the 3rd week after the pulpit incident, the nature of the threat escalated. Jane discovered it on a Tuesday morning when she rode out to the south pasture to check on a heifer that Cooper had reported was showing signs of difficult calving. She found the heifer fine, the calf already arrived and nursing, but she also found 3 of her fence posts pulled up and a section of wire cut. And through the gap, at the far edge of the field, Two men she did not know were moving a dozen of her cattle toward the Dooley boundary line. She rode hard and got ahead of them, pulling her mare across their path and sitting very still on horseback while they pulled up their horses and stared at her. "You're moving my cattle," she said. The closer of the two men, broad and unshaven, with the particular flat gaze of someone who has been hired specifically because he is not troubled by much, said, "These cattle strayed through a broken fence. The fence was cut this morning. Move those cattle back to where you found them." The man looked at her with the deliberate patience of someone who has been told this encounter will probably go a certain way. "Ma'am, we're just doing what Mr. Dooley asked us to do. He said these animals were on his property." "They were on mine," Jane said, "and you are on mine right now." "Miss Vaughn," said the second man, who was thinner and had a quality of watchfulness that was more unsettling than the first man's bluntness, "Mr. Dooley wanted me to tell you that this could all be resolved very simply if you were willing to have a conversation about the property. Tell Mr. Dooley he can put his offer in writing and send it to my lawyer in Abilene," Jane said, "and move those cattle." There was a long, testing silence. Jane held the men's gaze across the interval of dusty prairie and did not move and did not blink, and she kept her breathing even and her weight steady in the saddle. And she was aware, in a quiet and specific way, that she was one woman on a horse confronting two men who had been sent here with instructions that probably did not involve backing down easily. The sound of hoofbeats behind her was therefore something she noticed with a particular quality of relief that she would never have admitted to in any company. She did not look back. She kept her eyes on the two men. "Morning," said Arthur Brenner's voice from somewhere to her left and slightly behind, the tone of a man who has arrived at a gathering he was expecting to find exactly as he has found it. The thinner man's watchful expression shifted. The broader man recalibrated. The hierarchy of the encounter had changed. "We were just explaining to Miss Vaughn," the thin man said. "I heard the explanation," Arthur said. "Move the cattle back." A pause. The thin man looked at the broad man. Something moved between them. "Mr. Dooley is not here," Arthur said. "Move the cattle now." They moved the cattle. Jane watched them go, and then she turned to look at Arthur, who was on his roan, sitting with the easy authority of a man who occupies space by right rather than by effort. "Were you following me?" she said, and her voice had an edge that was not entirely unappreciative. "I was checking the north fence line," he said, "and I saw the cut posts from a distance. I thought I'd ride over and see what was happening." She held his gaze. "I was handling it." "I know you were." "I don't need Miss Vaughn," he said, and something in his voice stopped her, not because it was commanding but because it was honest. "You were doing fine. I'm not here because I thought you couldn't manage. I'm here because 2 against 1 is 2 against 1, and I wasn't going to watch that from a fence line." She took a breath. "Thank you," she said, and meant it without qualification. He nodded. They rode back toward the ranch house together, and somewhere between the south pasture and the yard gate the silence between them changed quality. It became the kind of silence that is not absence but presence, the kind that forms between two people who have moved past the preliminary stage and arrived somewhere neither of them has formally named. "Dooley is going to keep pushing," Arthur said when they were still 50 yards from the gate. "I know it. The fence cutting is one thing. If he starts running challenges through the county records, that's slower but harder to fight." "I have documentation," Jane said. "The deed is clean. My lawyer has copies of everything." He rode another few yards. "There's another approach Dooley might try that's harder to counter with documentation." She looked at him. "What approach?" He seemed to be choosing words with some care. "He might try to establish that you're not a credible property owner, that you're manageable." Calloway's pronouncement. "That's the first piece. The second piece is usually a legal challenge to a woman standing to hold title independently. It's been done in other counties. It requires a cooperative judge, and Judge Harlan in Comanche County has been known to be cooperative with the right people." Jane felt something cold settle in her chest. She had known this was possible in theory, but hearing it articulated plainly by someone who clearly understood the mechanism made it immediate and real. "What can I do about it?" Arthur said nothing for a moment. They reached the gate and he dismounted to open it, and she rode through, and he followed, and he latched the gate again, and still he hadn't answered. She turned her mare to face him. He had his hat in his hands and he was turning it by the brim, which was, she was learning, something he did when he was working up to saying something that mattered to him. "I've been thinking about something," he said. "Tell me what it is," she said. He looked up from the hat. "There is one way to make it very difficult for Dooley to challenge your standing to hold title," he said, "and for Calloway's opinion to become legally irrelevant, and for Judge Harlan to have no useful ground to stand on." She watched him. "If you were married," he said, "to a man whose standing in this county is unimpeachable, the legal architecture of what Dooley is building falls apart." The silence that followed was a very different kind of silence than any of the silences they had shared before. "You're proposing marriage," she said slowly. "I am saying it's a practical option that would solve a specific problem," he said, and then he stopped, and something shifted in his expression, something that cracked through the careful practicality of what he'd been constructing, and he said, "That's not entirely true." She waited. "I have been riding out here 6 times in 3 weeks," he said, "and every time I come up with a reason. The fence line, the newspaper, the boundary survey, every time." He turned the hat brim again. "Truth is that I come out here because when I'm here I feel like I'm in the right place, and when I'm not here I keep thinking about what we were talking about. I think about the things you said about the rail car economics. I think about the way you argued the breeding question. I think about—" He stopped. "Arthur," she said, and it was the first time she had used his given name, and they both registered it. He looked at her directly. "I know this is the worst possible way to have this conversation," he said. "You've just been through something humiliating and difficult, and you're under threat from 2 different directions, and the last thing you need is one more man who wants something from you. I know that. If you tell me to ride out and not come back, I will do that, and I will not make it awkward on the boundary line." She sat very still on her mare for what felt like a long time. The sensible calculation was clear. The protection his name and his standing would provide was real. The legal threat Dooley represented was real. The practical argument for this marriage was entirely sound, and she could accept it on those terms and never be dishonest about anything. But she was very tired of sensible calculations. She had been making sensible calculations since she was 19 years old, and they had kept her alive and solvent and alone. And alone was a thing she had made her peace with, but that did not mean she preferred it. "I do not need to be rescued," she said, and her voice was level. "I know that," he said. "If I were to consider what you're proposing," she said carefully, "it would not be because I require protection. It would be because I choose it." "That is the only reason I would want you to consider it," he said. She looked at him for a long moment, the straight bearing, the dark eyes, the hat turning slowly in his hands, the utter absence of performance in everything he did. And she said, "Let me think about it." "Take all the time you need," he said, and the relief in his voice was so carefully contained that she might have missed it if she hadn't been paying close attention. She thought about it for 4 days. And on the morning of the 5th day, she was in the stable brushing down her mare when she heard Cooper's voice outside saying something sharp and low. And then she heard a voice she recognized with a visceral cold recognition, Clem Dooley himself. She set down the brush and walked out of the stable into the yard. Dooley was on horseback, which meant he hadn't come to have a comfortable conversation. He was a large man who wore his prosperity in the particular way of men who have had enough money long enough to mistake it for a natural attribute. The good horse, the good coat, the easy authority of someone who expected outcomes to arrange themselves according to his preferences. He was 45, gray-haired, and had a smile that Jane had long since catalogued as one of the more dangerous things in Comanche County. He was smiling it now. "Miss Vaughn," he said, "I thought we might talk." Cooper was standing to the left of Dooley's horse, very still, and Jane read the situation correctly. "Mr. Dooley," she said, I believe I communicated through your men that any offer should go to my lawyer. Lawyers make things complicated, Dooley said pleasantly. I prefer a direct conversation between people who understand each other. What is it you think we understand about each other, Mr. Dooley? He looked around the yard, the fence, the barn, the ranch house with its solid construction and clean windows, the careful evidence of 6 years of hard labor, and his smile stayed exactly as it was. You've built a nice place here, he said. Your father would be proud. The mention of her father was deliberate. She kept her face still. The offer I'm prepared to make is more than fair, Dooley continued. You'd be well set. A woman alone at your age with your particular history, you'd do well to take money that would let you start somewhere fresh. Nobody knows you in Denver. Nobody knows you in Kansas City. I don't want to go to Denver or Kansas City, she said. Jane. The first name was another deliberate move, the move that said he had decided to skip the formal stages and establish dominance. I am trying to be kind here. The position you're in is only going to become less comfortable. The county is going to take an interest in how a single woman of questionable reputation is managing an operation this size. That kind of interest tends to get official. Judges have authority over property administration in disputed cases. There is no disputed case, she said. Not yet, he said. The silence that followed was the specific quality of an overt threat delivered in the language of helpfulness. Miss Vaughn, said Arthur Brenner's voice from the gate behind her. She did not know, then or later, how precisely he had known to come at that moment. He said afterward that he had been on his way to discuss the fence repair, which may have been true. What was true was that he rode through the gate on his roan horse, dismounted, tied up, and walked into the yard with the unhurried certainty of a man who belongs somewhere, and he placed himself standing beside Jane in a way that was not performative but simply physical here, present. This is where I am. Dooley's smile changed at the edges. Not much, but enough to read. Brenner, Dooley said, and the pleasantness in his voice shifted into a different key still present but with an undertone that acknowledged a new variable. Dooley, Arthur said, you're on private property. I'm having a friendly visit. Miss Vaughn didn't invite you. You should head out. A long pause, in which Dooley looked at the two of them standing in the yard, and did the calculation that was happening in front of him and made a decision. Think about my offer, Miss Vaughn, Dooley said, and he turned his horse and rode out through the gate without looking back. Cooper let out a breath. Jane heard it from 6 feet away. She turned to Arthur. She thought she would find something on his face, self-congratulation, maybe, the look of a man who had just demonstrated his usefulness. What she found instead was worry, genuine worry directed at her. Did he threaten you directly? Arthur asked. In the language of plausible deniability, she said. He mentioned Judge Harlan. Arthur nodded, and his jaw was tight. Jane looked at him for a long moment in the morning light of the ranch yard, with Cooper 30 feet away pretending to examine a fence post, and Ruth watching from the stable doorway with the expression of someone witnessing a moment they are not going to comment on yet. I've thought about your proposal, Jane said. Arthur went very still. I want to be clear about my terms, she said. The ranch stays mine. The deed stays in my name. Any agreement we make about land and operations we make together as partners with equal authority. Of course, he said. I am not going to become a different person because I am married. I am not going to stop managing my own affairs. I wouldn't ask you to. And I want you to understand, she said, and her voice was quieter now, not harder but more direct, that I am not doing this only for legal protection. If that were all it was, I would tell you so because I don't deal in deception. Something happened to Arthur Brenner's face. It was subtle, the way all the best things are subtle, a slight opening, a release of tension that she realized she had been seeing him carry for weeks without knowing what it was. Then why, he said, and the question was very quiet. Because you come out here 6 times in 3 weeks and every time you make me feel like myself, she said. And that is not a small thing, Arthur. That is not a small thing at all. He crossed the distance between them in 2 steps and took both her hands in both of his, and he held them the way you hold something you have been careful with for a long time and can now be less careful with, and he said, "Then we'll do this right." They were married 3 weeks later, on a Wednesday morning in June of 1882, by a justice of the peace in Abilene rather than by any reverend in Dusty Creek. Cooper stood witness for Jane, and a man named Frank who had ridden with Arthur for 10 years stood for him. Ruth wore her good dress and cried, which surprised everybody including Ruth. Diego shook Arthur's hand with the careful formality of a 19-year-old who takes ceremonies seriously, and then grinned at Jane with uncomplicated joy. It was not a large wedding. It was not a ceremonious wedding. But when the justice of the peace said the final words and Arthur turned to look at her with those dark, steady eyes and the expression that had no performance in it, Jane felt something settle in her that had been unsettled for a very long time. They rode back to the Vaughn ranch together, which was now the Brenner Ranch in the county records, though Jane maintained her operational authority exactly as they had agreed. And the practical question of consolidating 2 operations began immediately, because they were both fundamentally practical people, and there was a great deal of logistics to sort out. What was not purely practical was the first evening of their marriage, when the hands had gone to the bunkhouse, and Cooper was in his cabin and the ranch house was quiet, and Jane was in the kitchen finishing the accounts that she had left half done that morning, and Arthur came in and sat across from her, and watched her work with an expression of pure, uncomplicated contentment, and she looked up and caught him looking, and neither of them said anything for a long moment. "You're watching me do accounting," she said. "I know," he said. "That seems like a strange thing to want to do on your wedding evening." "I've been wanting to watch you think for 6 weeks," he said. "I'm enjoying it." She felt warmth rise in her face, which was not a sensation she was accustomed to and was unprepared for, and she looked back down at the ledger, and she heard him laugh quietly, a warm, private sound that she had not heard from him before, the laugh of a man who is genuinely, helplessly happy about something. That laugh did something permanent to her. She filed it away in a deep place. Over the following months, the work of building a combined operation kept them both fully occupied, which was fortunate because fully occupied people do not have time for anxiety. Arthur moved his core operations to an office in the Vaughn Brenner ranch house and maintained his northern holding with a foreman he trusted after an extensive and occasionally frustrating search. Jane's cattle contracts were renegotiated with the help of Harlan Macy in Fort Worth, who turned out to be exactly as fair dealing as advertised, and the shift away from the Buyers Association network cost them some short-term money and saved them a great deal of long-term complication. Dooley made 2 more moves against them in the first year. The first was the Judge Gambit. He filed a motion in county court in September, claiming a boundary discrepancy on the southern acreage. Jane's Abilene lawyer came down in person, which was a significant expense and worth every cent. The documentation was clean, and the motion was dismissed in 2 days, at which point Judge Harlan apparently reconsidered the wisdom of antagonizing a man of Arthur Brenner's standing, and Dooley's leverage over the judiciary was revealed as more limited than advertised. The second move was the one Jane had not anticipated, and it came through Reverend Calloway rather than through the courts. In January of 1883, Calloway announced from his pulpit that the Brenner marriage was, in his pastoral opinion, entered into for secular rather than sacred purposes, and therefore of questionable spiritual validity. This was theologically creative nonsense, but it was designed to keep social pressure on the community not to restore Jane to full standing. Arthur was in the congregation that Sunday. He had not attended Calloway's church before, but he had decided, that particular morning, to attend. He stood up when Calloway finished speaking, which was not something one did in Reverend Calloway's congregation, and the silence that fell was absolutely complete. "Reverend Calloway," Arthur said from the third pew, and his voice carried to every corner of the room without effort, the voice of a man who spoke to large groups of men and cattle, and whether on a regular basis. My wife is the most capable, honest, and decent person I know. She has built something real in this county through 6 years of hard work under difficult circumstances. What you have done to her reputation in this room and from this pulpit has been unjust, and you have done it in the service of a man who wants her land and not out of any genuine pastoral concern. I think you know that. I think a number of people in this room know that. And I am asking you in front of everyone here to say so. The silence stretched to something extraordinary. Calloway's face went through several colors. He was not a stupid man, and he was looking at Arthur Brenner, who had just made the calculation visible to an entire congregation, and he was also looking at the faces of his congregation, some of which were showing things he had not expected to see: their discomfort, recognition, a particular quality of unease that comes from being implicated in something you would prefer not to examine closely. He did not recant fully in that moment, but he did not double down. He said something about pastoral judgment and community welfare that was so hedged as to be meaningless, and then he ended the service. And in the conversation that followed in the yard outside, 3 women came to speak to Jane directly, women who had been keeping their distance since May of the previous year, and the nature of what they said was apologetic in the way that people who cannot say sorry directly sometimes express themselves, through over-effusive warmth and small practical offers. It was not a full restoration, it was a crack in the wall. The full accounting of Clem Dooley's operations came 6 months later, in July of 1883, and it came not from any action Arthur or Jane had taken, but from a man named Tom Riesser, who had been Dooley's foreman for 4 years, and had been quietly building a record of the less legitimate aspects of Dooley's business operations. Tom Riesser had not built this record out of civic virtue. He had built it because Dooley had cheated him out of a year's wages, and Tom Riesser was the patient kind of angry. The document Tom Riesser brought to the Texas Rangers office in Austin contained evidence of cattle rustling on a systematic scale, the bribery of 2 county officials, including the original cooperative version of Judge Harlan, and the financial details of the loan that had been made to Hector Vaughn, including records suggesting that the terms of the loan had been deliberately structured to maximize default risk, and that the men who had persuaded Hector Vaughn of the urgency of repayment had been in Dooley's employ. It did not directly implicate Dooley in Hector Vaughn's death, but the implication lived clearly in the architecture of everything else. Jane read the Ranger's summary report when it was shared with her as a courtesy by the lead ranger, a spare professional man named Lieutenant Reyes, who had the particular quality of competence that comes from doing difficult work without shortcuts. She read it at the kitchen table with Arthur sitting across from her, and she read it straight through without stopping, and when she set it down she was very still for a while. "It won't bring him back," Arthur said quietly. "No," she said. "And it's not a complete accounting. The death, I know," she said. "I know it won't be proven to the standard they need." She looked at the window at the summer light on the mesquite. "But it is the truth. It is the shape of the truth, laid out in a document that will become part of the official record." She turned back to Arthur. "My father wasn't a careful man. He made bad decisions and trusted the wrong people, but he didn't deserve what happened to him, and people will know it now." "People will know it," Arthur said. Clem Dooley was arrested in August of 1883, tried in federal court, and convicted on the rustling and bribery charges. The cattle operation was dismantled. His land holdings, which had been acquired through questionable means in several documented instances, were subject to legal challenge, and several of the smaller ranches that had been swallowed into his operation during the previous decade were partially restored to their original owners through a claims process that took 2 years and was navigated, in Jane's case, with the help of her increasingly well-prepared Abilene lawyer. Reverend Calloway, deprived of his most significant patron and facing a congregation that was quietly reassessing a number of things, resigned his position in the spring of 1884, and relocated to another county, which satisfied nobody and hurt nobody particularly, which was perhaps the most accurate assessment of his actual moral weight in the universe. None of this happened quickly or cleanly. The legal processes were slow and sometimes maddening, and there were months in 1883 and 1884 when the paperwork alone felt like a second job. But the threat was resolved, and resolved completely, and by the end of 1884, the Vaughn Brenner operation was running on solid legal ground with clean titles and working buyer relationships, and a reputation in the county that had been rebuilt brick by brick from the rubble of Calloway's campaign. What was happening at the same time, through all of this, underneath all of this, woven through every practical problem and legal battle and cattle count and boundary negotiation, was something much quieter and much more important. Arthur and Jane were falling in love. They had been falling since the water trough and possibly before, and the process had been interrupted and overlaid by practicalities and crises and survival concerns, but it was happening with the steady, inevitable character of water finding its level. Every conversation was a discovery. Every disagreement was a revelation of the specific quality of each other's thinking. Every evening at the kitchen table was an accretion of evidence that this person beside you was more interesting than any person you had previously been beside, and that the world was measurably better from this particular angle. Jane discovered that Arthur read everything he could get his hands on, that he had a talent for mathematics he was oddly modest about, that he was a terrible cook who made excellent coffee, that he laughed rarely, but when he laughed it was entirely genuine, and that he had a habit, when he was thinking hard about something, of going very still in a way that she had learned to distinguish from unhappiness. Arthur discovered that Jane had an absolutely merciless memory, that she was a better judge of horse character than anyone he had ever met, that she cried at books but never about practical things, that she made decisions with a clarity that he found beautiful in the way that very precise and functional things are beautiful, and that she had a quality of concentrated attention when she was interested in something. In anything, the breeding records, the novel on the shelf, the stars on a clear night. That made being the object of that attention the best feeling he had known. On a night in the fall of 1883, they were on the porch after supper, the way they had developed a habit of sitting on the porch after supper in the good weather, and the sky over the Texas plains was doing what it does in autumn, spreading out its complete inventory of stars with the prodigal generosity of a country that has enormous amounts of sky to offer. "I want to tell you something," Jane said. "Tell me," Arthur said. She had been thinking about how to say it for weeks, turning the words over the way you turn a coin, examining each face. In the end, what she said was simple. "I am happy. I want you to know that, not because things are resolved or because we won something. Because of you specifically, because of this specifically." She gestured at the porch, the stars, the space between them that was not, that evening, actually very much space. "I wanted to say it plainly." He turned to look at her in the way he had of looking at her that she never quite got used to, as though she were the most interesting thing in the visible world, and also as though he knew exactly how fortunate he was. "I know," he said. "I've known for a while. You've known I was happy. I've known I am. And I've known it was." He stopped and made a small gesture with one hand that meant something she was learning to read. "You," he said. "It's specifically you." She leaned over and kissed him, which was not the first time, but felt, in its quality of intention and openness, like a first time, and he put his arm around her and she rested her head against his shoulder, and they sat like that while the Texas night settled and deepened, and the coyotes discussed their business somewhere in the middle distance. "I was thinking," Arthur said, after a comfortable silence, "about the east pasture." She laughed. "Of course you were." The soil profile on the eastern section would support Arthur. "What? We can talk about the east pasture tomorrow." A pause. "Yes," he said, "tomorrow is fine." They stayed on the porch until the stars turned and the night cooled and went inside together. and the world contracted to the dimensions of a house where two people had built a life, and that was the best possible size for it. In the early spring of 1884, Jane found herself with a new and absorbing piece of information to process. She sat with it for several days, doing what she always did with important things, which was turning it over carefully until she understood it from all its angles. Then she found Arthur at the north fence line where he was doing a post-inspection with Diego, and she waited until Diego had moved further along the line, and she said, "I need to tell you something." He turned from the fence post immediately, reading something in her voice. "What is it?" She had considered various ways to say it and landed on the most direct. "We're going to have a child," she said. He was very still for a moment in the way she knew, and then the stillness broke into something that was entirely not his usual contained expression, something open and warm and almost startled that she had never seen from him before and that she would remember exactly for the rest of her life. He crossed to her in 3 steps and took her face in both his hands and looked at her, and the expression was still there, that unguarded, genuine astonishment that something this good was happening and was real. "Are you all right?" he asked. How are you feeling?" "I'm fine," she said. "I feel completely normal. I have more energy than usual, actually." "That sounds like you," he said softly. She put her hands over his. "Are you?" "Yes," he said, before she could finish the question, which was the right answer. Their son was born in November of 1884, in the ranch house, attended by a midwife from Abilene who was competent and unflappable. He was healthy and loud, and Arthur held him with the particular terrified reverence of a man who has not previously held a newborn and is aware that he is handling something more important than anything he has handled before. They named him Hector for Jane's father. Arthur had suggested it, and Jane had been unable to speak for a moment when he did. "You don't have to," Arthur said, misreading her silence. "It was just a thought." "No," she managed. "Yes, yes, Hector, that's right." Cooper cried, which he managed to disguise as a coughing fit with very limited success. Diego brought a carved wooden horse he had made himself, smooth and carefully detailed, the best gift in the room. Ruth declared Hector the finest-looking child she had seen in at least 10 years, which was high praise from Ruth. The first year of Hector's life was the fullest year Jane had experienced, and she was someone whose years had generally been full. She was running a combined operation, managing contracts, raising a child, building something with another person that she had never expected to build, and finding at every turn that the building was the best part. She and Arthur had developed a working rhythm that was also a relational rhythm. The morning conversation over coffee that covered both the day's work and everything else, the evening on the porch, the particular shorthand of two people who have learned each other thoroughly enough to communicate in efficient and accurate fragments. They disagreed. Of course they disagreed. They were two highly independent and strongly opinionated people who had both been making all their own decisions for years. They disagreed about cattle breeding programs and buyer strategy, and whether the South pasture needed resting this year, and whether a third well was worth the expense right now. The disagreements were never the kind that left damage because the foundational respect was unassailable. He never dismissed her analysis. She never dismissed his. They argued to conclusion rather than to victory, which is a skill that requires practice and mutual trust. Harlan Macy came through from Fort Worth that spring with a contract offer for the following year that was 20% above the previous year's rate, which was a result of their reputation for consistent, well-managed cattle and the network relationships Arthur had leveraged. They celebrated this at the kitchen table with good whiskey that Arthur had been saving for a significant occasion, and Hector, who was 6 months old and had recently discovered that enthusiastic vocalization got attention, contributed commentary from his cradle in the corner. "He's going to be loud," Arthur said, looking at his son with a helpless affection that Jane found she could not look at directly for too long without feeling something too large for a weekday evening. "He's enthusiastic," Jane said. "There's a difference. He gets the enthusiasm from you, and the stubbornness, "That's shared," Arthur said. She looked up to find him grinning, and she shook her head, and the warmth of the room and the evening and the life they had built settled around them like something permanent. By 1886, the Brenner Ranch had grown to 25,000 acres through the legitimate purchase of 2 adjacent parcels, one of which had been part of the Dooley estate sold at auction. There was particular satisfaction in that purchase, acknowledged by both of them without extended comment. The operation ran 450 head of good cattle and employed 8 hands, including Cooper, who had declined all suggestions of retirement with the firm statement that he would decide when he was done and nobody else would, and Ruth, who had taken on a supervisory role over the interior operations of the ranch and ran them with the same iron competence she brought to everything. Diego was 23 and had become, in the 5 years since Jane first hired him at 17, a skilled and thoughtful cattleman in his own right. Arthur had offered him a foreman's role the previous year, and Diego had accepted with the careful gravity of a young man who takes his responsibilities seriously. He was good at it. Jane had, in 1885, also begun the work she had originally trained for, quietly and informally at first. She started teaching reading to 3 of the hands' children whose families lived on the property. This grew as things Jane put her attention into tended to grow, into a more organized arrangement where she taught 6 children 3 mornings a week in the ranch house parlor. It was not a school in any formal sense. It was a practical woman with books and a gift for explanation, and a firm conviction that literacy was not a luxury but a necessity. Arthur watched this with the particular quality of attention he brought to anything Jane did, which was full and appreciative and never condescending. He also, at her suggestion, approached the county about the possibility of establishing an actual school on the property, which was a longer project but one that both of them intended to see through. In the late summer of 1886, Jane found herself with the same quiet, complex, carefully processed realization she had processed 2 years earlier. She went to the north fence line again, because apparently that was where these conversations happened, and Arthur was there again, replacing a post with Diego, and she waited for Diego to move along. "I need to tell you something," she said. Arthur turned from the fence immediately, and she watched his face as she told him, watched the same astonished warmth break through the containment, and she loved him with a completeness that she could not have found words for if anyone had asked, which fortunately nobody did. Their second child was a girl, born in March of 1887. They named her Clara Ruth Brenner, Ruth's name inserted into the middle by Jane's firm unilateral decision, which Ruth received in a state of complete wordlessness for approximately 45 seconds before recovering herself and declaring that it was a perfectly suitable name, and she was not going to be sentimental about it, and then being completely sentimental about it for the rest of the day. Clara arrived into a household that was large and busy and full of people who were glad she was there. Hector, who was 2.5, was initially uncertain about the arrangement, and then became fiercely proprietary in the way of small children. This was his Clara, and everyone needed to be informed of this fact regularly. Arthur handled the transition with the combination of patience and gentle firmness that Jane had observed him apply to other young creatures with strong opinions and limited vocabulary. The country was changing around them in ways that were sometimes uncomfortable and sometimes genuinely good. The railroads were pushing further, which affected the cattle market. Homesteaders were filling in the open range, which changed the character of the land and the water politics. The Apache and Comanche nations had been subject to continued terrible injustice, forced onto reservations through policies that were brutal in their casual disregard for human life and dignity, and Jane had, over the years, developed a view of this injustice that was not the prevailing view in her county, and she said so when it was relevant, which Arthur respected without always entirely sharing. Though his view had been shifting in the direction of hers over 4 years of marriage, and one of the more substantial pieces of evidence for the accuracy of her judgment. The Texas spring of 1888 brought a dry, warm stretch that was good for the cattle and good for the people, and brought also, on a Wednesday afternoon in April, a visitor that Jane had not expected. He arrived on the property and asked for Jane Vaughn, not Jane Brenner, which suggested he knew her name from a time before the marriage. Jane came out to the yard to find a man of about 40, lean and road-worn, with the look of someone who had been traveling for a while and thinking hard during all of it. It was Paul Reeves, the surveyor from Houston, the man whose unexpected married status had become the first pillar of Calloway's attack on her reputation, 6 years and a lifetime ago. He looked at her with an expression that was complicated and did not entirely know where to put itself. "Miss Vaughn," he started. "Mrs. Brenner," she said, not unkindly. "Mrs. Brenner," he took his hat off. I've heard about what happened after I left Dusty Creek, what was said about you." He paused. "My wife passed in '84. I know that doesn't." He paused again. "I owed you an apology. I owed it to you a long time ago. I was a coward about what I did, and the consequences of it fell on you, and that was wrong." Jane looked at him for a moment. Arthur was on the porch behind her. She could feel his presence there without looking, still and attentive. "Mr. Reeves," she said, "I accept your apology. What happened was wrong, and I'm glad you know it. You should make peace with it and then let it go, because I have." She meant it. The thing that had happened with Paul Reeves had once been sharp and then had become dull, and now it was simply a fact from a previous chapter, relevant mainly as one piece of the sequence that had led her here, to this yard, to this life. He looked at her, at the ease in her bearing, the solidity of the ranch behind her, the man on the porch, the sounds of children and activity from inside the house, and something in his expression resolved. "You're well," he said. "I am very well," she said. He nodded, put his hat back on, and rode out. She watched him go and then turned back to the porch, and Arthur was leaning against the post with his arms crossed and an expression that was neutral except for his eyes, which were asking a question. "I'm fine," she said. "I was fine before he came, and I'm fine now." "I know," he said. "You were very well behaved, standing there not intervening." "It wasn't my apology to receive," he said, "or my anger to dispense. It was yours." She went up the porch steps and stopped beside him, close enough to bump her shoulder against his arm, which she did. He unfolded one arm and put it around her, and they looked out at the yard where the afternoon light was doing its amber thing to the mesquite and the red dust and the ordinary beautiful details of their particular piece of the world. "Cooper is going to need help with the south fence this week," she said. "Diego can take it," Arthur said. "Diego is managing the buyers from Fort Worth on Thursday." "Then we'll both take it," Arthur said. "It'll be good to be outside." She turned her face up to his. "I love you," she said, which she said with some frequency now and would never be cured of saying. "I love you," he said, and kissed her, and the porch creaked and the mesquite moved in the warm air, and inside the house Hector could be heard explaining something at length to Clara, who was 1 year old and receptive to explanations. The east pasture was, in the spring of 1888, in the process of being expanded to support the additional 50 head they planned to add the following year. This was a project they had been discussing on and off for 2 years, the kind of long-term planning that satisfies because it is grounded in confidence about the future. They had earned that confidence by building something solid enough to have a future, and they both knew it. The school was established on the Brenner property in September of 1888 with the county's formal recognition, and a teacher hired from Austin. A young woman named Miss Hartley, who was 22 years old, recently graduated, and possessed of the combination of firmness and genuine enthusiasm that made a good teacher. Jane worked alongside her in the first semester, both of them learning from the other, and the school grew to include 14 children from the surrounding ranches by the following spring. Cooper turned 67 in 1888 and remained on the property doing lighter work, insisting he was indispensable, which he was, though not always in the practical ways he imagined. His irreplaceability was of a more fundamental kind. He was the continuity, the living connection between the ranch's history and its present, the man who had known Jane before she had built anything and had watched her build all of it. He had his cabin and his standing invitation to every meal in the ranch house, and he used it regularly. And Hector had decided that Cooper was the most interesting person on the property, a judgment Cooper accepted with enormous pleasure. Ruth had remained through everything, had become the fourth wall of the house in the way that some people become necessary to the architecture of a life. She ran the household side of the operation with the competence that Jane had learned to trust completely. She mentored Diego on questions of ranch management in the direct way of someone who had learned things the hard way and intended to transfer that knowledge efficiently. And she loved Clara with a ferocity that was all the more meaningful for being entirely unearned and therefore entirely pure. The years settled into their rhythms, and the rhythms were good ones. In the summer of 1890, when Hector was 5 and Clara was 3, and the ranch was running at its best-ever capacity, Jane and Arthur sat on the porch on a clear July evening that was unusually cool for the season, and the stars over Texas were doing their extravagant usual work, and Hector was asleep inside and Clara was asleep inside, and the whole world was at the appropriate scale for what Jane needed to say. "I've been thinking about the school," she said. "What about it?" Arthur said. "I want to expand it, formally. Not just a ranch school, a proper school that serves the whole county, not just our property." She had been turning this idea over for a year. "There are children in Dusty Creek and the surrounding area who have no access to any education. Working families, families without land, the freedmen's families especially." She paused. "I know it will be complicated politically." "Most things worth doing are," Arthur said. "You think we should do it?" "I think you've already decided to do it," he said, "and I think it's the right decision, and I think it will be hard, and I think it will be worth it." He turned to look at her. "And I think I will be very glad to be involved." She smiled, and the smile was the complete kind, the one she had only recently fully learned to give. "You realize this means a great deal of correspondence with county authorities." "I'll handle the county authorities," he said, with the flat confidence of a man who has dispatched county authorities before and feels adequately prepared. "And a building. I know a carpenter in Abilene. And fundraising. I know people with money who have not been doing anything particularly useful with it." He looked at her steadily. "Jane, we'll build a school. The Brenner County School, as it would eventually be named by the county authorities, opened in September of 1892 in a purpose-built building on the property. One room with good windows and a proper library of donated books, serving 31 children from 12 different family situations, including 7 children from the freedmen's families who had been farming rented land east of Dusty Creek for a decade. It was not a perfect solution to an imperfect world. It was a beginning, and Jane had learned that beginnings compound if you tend them. By the fall of 1892, Jane was 35 years old and Arthur was 41, and they had been married 10 years. And the ranch was 28,000 acres and 4 staff, who had been there since the beginning, and a school, and a legacy that was built from the ground up by 2 people who had each arrived at the water trough of that Sunday morning carrying entirely different versions of solitude, and found in each other the particular and irreplaceable person who made solitude both unnecessary and impossible. They stood at the opening of the school together, the 2 of them, and Hector, who was 7 and wore his good clothes with the slightly martyred expression of a boy who would rather be on horseback, and Clara, who was 5 and had her mother's dark eyes and her father's unhurried directness, and a personality that Cooper said was going to be formidable, and Ruth said was already formidable, and Arthur, and Jane said nothing about because they were both in the middle of it. Miss Hartley, in her 4th year at the school now, made a brief speech about education and opportunity that was graceful and genuine and made Cooper's eyes go bright. The children filed in. The books were on the shelves. Walking back to the ranch house afterward, Arthur reached down and took Jane's hand in his, which was not something they always did in public, but was something they did sometimes when the moment asked for it. "Well," he said. "Well," she said, "that was a good thing we just did." "It was," she agreed. "We should do more good things." She squeezed his hand. "We have a whole list." Hector, running ahead of them with the energy of a child released from formal ceremony, turned and called back, "Papa, can we look at the south herd before supper?" "After you change your clothes," Arthur called back. "I'm already changing while I'm running," Hector said, with his mother's unassailable logic delivered in his father's flat tone, and Jane laughed, really laughed, the full uncalculated sound of someone who finds everything about the moment genuine. Arthur looked at her laughing, and his face did the thing she had been watching it do for 10 years, the particular opening, the specific quality of a man who has found himself somewhere he never expected to be and is fully, completely glad. "What?" she said. "Nothing," he said. "Everything." He shook his head slightly. "You," she held his gaze, "still specifically me." "Always specifically you," he said, and meant it with the full weight of 10 years and everything they had built and survived and chosen. Every morning at the kitchen table, and every argument about cattle strategy, and every evening on the porch, and every child asleep inside the house, and every fence post, and buyer contract and court document and book on the shelf, an act of deliberate justice, they had committed together against a world that had tried. From a pulpit and from a banker's back office and from a county judge's willingness to be purchased, to make Jane Vaughn small. She was not small. She had never been small. And in Arthur Brenner she had found the one thing she had not known she needed, not rescue, not protection, not a name to carry, but a person who saw her completely and was glad about what he saw, and who met her where she was rather than where he might have preferred her to be. The Texas evening came in over the mesquite, and the good grass and the cattle and the south pasture, and the school with its new windows and the ranch house, where Cooper was making coffee and Ruth was managing supper with her usual uncompromising efficiency, and Clara was explaining something to a cat in the kitchen doorway, and Hector was already changed and back outside, and asking Diego about the south herd with the earnest intensity of a 7-year-old who has decided to take cattle seriously. And Jane and Arthur Brenner walked home across their land, hand in hand, under a sky that was filling slowly with stars, and everything was exactly as it should be. The word that Reverend Calloway had said from his pulpit 10 years ago was not forgotten. Injustice should not be forgotten, because forgetting is how it perpetuates. But it had been answered not by argument or legal victory or public vindication, though all of those things had come, but by the simple, enduring evidence of a life lived fully and well, by two people who had chosen each other with open eyes and had never stopped choosing each other since. Unfit. The word had been the beginning of everything. And everything had turned out to be more than enough.